Three strangers share a room where no one dares to speak. Sometimes silence reveals more pain than any words. On a winter morning, when the world had given up hope, a quiet man and his aging German shepherd found themselves drawn into a mystery no one else would see. An anonymous plea, a child at the door, and a blizzard that threatened to swallow every last bit of warmth. Edgewater Falls would never be the same. In the silent struggle between loss and love, could a single act of kindness and a dog's loyal heart heal the deepest wounds? Stay with this story. The answer may change you. Long before sunrise, the cold pressed in like a memory Wade Callahan could not quite forget. Morning crept over Edgewater Falls with the slow confidence of January. The lake locked in gray silence. The air so cold, even Orion's breath rose in visible clouds. Wade zipped his faded green jacket higher, calloused hands in the pockets, and tapped once at the battered flashlight clipped to his belt. His boots found the brittle crust atop snow, crunching with each unhurried step along the shoreline, where reeds poked out like old brush bristles through ice. Orion walked beside him, a broad-shouldered German shepherd, fur dense with hues of dusk and clay, eyes the color of distant thunderheads. They moved together without hurry or purpose, each accustomed to these silent rounds. Most homes facing the lake had gone dark for the winter. Curtains drawn, snow drifted up to porch rails, wooden docks abandoned to the slow freeze. There was comfort, or something close to it, in the rhythm, the measured gait of a man who had known years of schedules and loss, and the steady company of a dog who understood what it meant to have nowhere else to be. Sometimes, in the thickest part of the mist, Wade would pause and listen to the breath of the land, the sigh of wind against bare birch, the distant groan of ice shifting beneath the snow. Orion always stopped with him, his large paws silent, his nose raised, reading the world as only a dog could. Some mornings, Wade imagined the village breathing alongside them, the empty cottages, the silent boathouses, the invisible hush of hundreds of absent stories layered in ice. This morning was colder than most. Wade's knuckles ached, but he kept walking, passing the old bait shop and the boarded-up general store. Frost patterned the windows with ferns and feathers, erasing all traces of life inside. He ran his fingers along the rough wood of the rail as he passed, thinking briefly of his own house, its small rooms packed with winter's quiet, his son's yellow raincoat still hanging by the door, untouched for years. Orion veered left toward the edge of the dock, tail low, ears pricked, as if listening for something not yet spoken. Wade let him lead. There was no rush here, not in this place forgotten by time, not for two creatures made for waiting. Ice cracked softly beneath the dog's weight, but Orion's steps were light, careful, as if he remembered some older pain. They followed the water's edge, rounding the bend past house number 8, then 10, most with windows shuttered and stoops swept clean by the wind. At house number 12, Wade paused. Here the snow seemed deeper, undisturbed, a small drift pressed up against the porch steps. For a moment, he felt a faint unease, nothing he could name, just the cold collecting in the hollows behind his ribs. Orion stood beside him, head tilted, nose high, but made no sound. Wade's gaze drifted up to the eaves, where icicles hung in perfect rows. He remembered dimly summers when the house had been bright with laughter, an old man in a blue flannel shirt rocking on the porch, calling to his grandchildren. Those children must be grown now, scattered or gone. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. It was only a house, yet the silence it held felt different, as if something waited in the shadows for the courage to speak. Wade moved on, boots crunching, Orion falling in at his side. They passed a mailbox laced in frost, its red flag drooping. Wade reached in, almost by habit. He pulled out a single white envelope, unmarked, but for a childlike scrawl. "Please help the kids at number 12. The paper was cold in his hands, the ink a little smeared by the damp. He stared at the message, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breath. Orion's warm flank pressed against his knee. A feeling came over him, not surprise exactly, but the slow turn of something waking. Wade had seen too much to trust blindly, too much to leap to action on the word of a stranger. And yet, as the lake wind picked up and Orion leaned gently into his leg, a fragment of old duty stirred within him. Faint, almost painful. For a long moment, they stood together in the thin light, snowflakes settling on Orion's fur, the envelope limp in Wade's hand. There was no plan, not yet, only the hush of a world on the cusp of change. The patient waiting of two souls who knew what it was to lose faith and still, in some small way, keep walking. As they turned back toward home, Orion paused once more, looking over his shoulder at the dark house lost in the white hush. Wade hesitated, then followed the dog's gaze, his own face unreadable. In the distance, a crow called, and the sound disappeared into the trees. The road behind them showed only a single set of footprints, man and dog, etched side by side in the unbroken snow. The day had not truly begun, and already the shape of it felt altered, the silence holding a question neither could yet name. Wade pressed the envelope inside his coat and let his hand rest on Orion's broad back. For now, that was enough. Wade Callahan left the letter on the narrow windowsill by his kitchen table, its single sentence seeming to seep into the worn wood. He kept glancing at it as the day slipped by, as if the words might rearrange themselves or vanish. "Please help the kids at number 12. There was nothing else, no name, no signature, only a plea written with the uneven loops of a child or a trembling hand. The envelope caught the thin winter light at odd angles, a small, persistent ghost. He busied himself with small routines, filling Orion's water bowl, setting a fresh log on the fire, checking the weather on his battered old radio. The sky outside never brightened, just moved from gray to dusk and back again. Orion, restless, paced the length of the cabin with silent urgency, nails clicking faintly on the wooden floor, then stopped by the window, nose nearly pressed to the frost. Wade noticed the way the dog's ears twitched each time the wind rattled the eaves, the way his gaze kept flicking toward the long, snow-choked lane that ran past the houses. Edgewater Falls was not the sort of place that welcomed surprises. In winter, the world shrank to simple things, the struggle to stay warm, to make the larder last, to keep loneliness at bay. Yet that day felt altered, as if the air itself waited for some answer. Each time Wade made a circuit through the house, checking the pipes for freeze, drawing water to boil, folding a shirt that would never fit a child, he found himself looking at the envelope again. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a child's prank, a mistake, but the words clung to him. By late afternoon, clouds piled low over the lake, their bellies heavy with snow. Orion had grown visibly unsettled, nose working overtime, body taut in a way Wade hadn't seen since the last emergency rescue, years ago now, when they'd pulled a boy out of the river's edge before the thaw. There was a dignity in the animal's worry, a kind of silent communication Wade had come to trust more than any words. Still, he hesitated. Bad weather, isolation, ghosts of old failures. He'd learned to doubt his own instincts, to stand back, to do nothing and call it wisdom. Twilight deepened. The street lamps along the main road blinked on, their pale light smudged by snow. A few flakes began to fall, at first tentative, then steady, feathering the porch steps and piling atop Orion's broad shoulders when he stepped outside for his evening patrol. Wade watched him circle the yard, tail low, sniffing the air with the caution of a soldier on unfamiliar ground. There was nothing out of place, only the dark, only the envelope, only the house at number 12, huddled in its own silence. Inside, Wade sat by the stove and let his hands thaw around a mug of tea gone cold. He traced the rim of the cup, eyes drifting to the photo tacked beside the door. His son, blond and grinning in a bright yellow coat, holding a string of lake perch with both hands. The memory ached less now, but only just. Loss, he'd learned, was a kind of snow. It piled up quietly until the weight of it changed the shape of the world. Night fell quickly. The storm that was forecast on the radio arrived with little warning, wind howling down from the north, rattling loose shingles, pelting the glass with fine, icy grit. Wade checked the lanterns, wound the clock, made sure Orion's bed was in its usual spot beside the door. The dog, however, refused to settle. He rose and paced, circled the window, sat with his nose aimed toward the narrow, rutted lane that led out toward number 12. Around midnight, when the wind had dulled to a low moan and the fire had burned down to soft coals, Orion's unease became something sharper. He let out a sound, a breath, half a whine, almost a question, then pressed his paw gently against Wade's knee. It was a quiet plea, not for food or play, but for attention, for trust. Wade got up, padded to the window and peered out. The snow had buried the porch rails. Visibility was near nothing. Somewhere beyond the drifted street, the house at number 12 stood as dark as ever. He turned back to Orion, who met his gaze without blinking. There was something raw and expectant in the dog's eyes, a flicker of old hurt that Wade recognized, having carried it himself for so many years. Doubt, fear, the sharp edge of caring for things you cannot save. For a moment, man and dog simply stood together, their reflections doubled in the frosted glass. Wade sat again, his back to the stove, and let the hush settle. He remembered other winters, other signals ignored, neighbors missed, calls not returned, regrets heavy as ice. The letter on the sill seemed to pulse in the lamplight. He thought of the children he'd failed to help long ago, before the world narrowed to just himself and a loyal dog. Outside, the wind gathered force once more. Orion pressed himself against the door, eyes fixed on the night, body rigid but silent. Every so often he turned to glance at Wade, as if waiting for some unspoken order. Wade thought of all the times he'd chosen inaction and called it caution, all the times he'd let the world move on without him. Tonight, the stillness felt less like safety, more like surrender. He rose finally and set out Orion's harness, gloved hands slow and deliberate. Orion sat patiently, head bowed, accepting the gesture without excitement. Wade fastened the buckles, pausing to press his palm against the dog's shoulder, the warmth grounding him. They stood a moment in the hush, then Wade stepped onto the porch, Orion close at his side, and listened to the storm. The world was white and whirling, but beneath it all, something old and patient waited to be answered. Tonight, he would not sleep. Neither would Orion. There was a house down the lane, lights out, windows shuttered, a letter on the sill. One quiet request in a world where most requests went unanswered. The road between them felt impossibly long, but Wade understood now, as the wind whipped round and the dog pressed forward, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to look away. He left the lamp burning in the window, a small promise flickering against the dark. Night pressed hard against the windows, glass trembling as gusts swept in from the lake. The fire in Wade's stove had dwindled to a drowsy pulse, low embers glowing just enough to trace the worn lines of the rug, the thick dappled fur along Orion's flanks. Wade stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the edge of the sink, staring at nothing but the reflection of lamplight off whitewashed cabinets. It was too late for sleep, too early for dawn, one of those hours when regret weighed most and the world felt abandoned, silent as a locked drawer. Orion stirred first. Wade felt rather than heard. The dog rise, weight shifting, nails softly testing the floorboards. The wind had settled into a deep, moaning hush. In that stillness, the smallest sound became a signal. A tapping, faint as the ticking of a wristwatch, came from the porch. Wade turned, breath caught in his chest. Orion stood at the door, body rigid, head tilted to listen. The tap came again. Not the fierce banging of a storm-thrown branch, not the clatter of a shutter, but something so tentative and light it might have been a child's fingernail or the wing of a moth. Wade crossed the floor, heart slow but loud in his ears. He knelt beside Orion and let his hand rest on the dog's ruff. Orion didn't growl, only gave a low, steady exhale, his way of saying wait. Wade reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and with his other hand eased the deadbolt back. The cold came first, biting and raw, a sharp breath across his face as he cracked open the door. On the porch, huddled between the faded welcome mat and the slats of the wooden step, sat a little girl. She wore a coat 2 sizes too small, sleeves fraying, buttons missing, dark hair a tangled mess around a narrow, wind-chapped face. Her feet were bare, toes raw and red against the boards, one heel drawn up tight under the hem of her coat. She gripped a faded cloth doll with a missing eye in one hand, her other hand tucked against her chest. For a moment, she stared at the light, pupils wide and wild. The air in the entryway crackled with cold and something else, an ache Wade recognized from old photographs and old wounds, fear sharpened by endurance. Orion was the first to move. He lowered himself, belly flat to the ground, head tilted, amber eyes fixed on the child's face. He didn't bark or whine. Instead, he crept forward, inch by inch, until his nose was level with the girl's outstretched hand. The girl didn't flinch. She watched the dog, breathing in short, measured bursts. After a moment, she reached out, so slowly Wade wondered if she'd ever touched a dog before, and brushed Orion's fur with her fingers, something unspooled in her posture, a single thread of tension slackening. Wade's voice, when it came, was low, nearly lost in the wind. "Come in, sweetheart." He didn't crowd her or ask her name, didn't pepper her with questions. He only stepped back, holding the door open, waiting as the porch light flickered overhead. Orion waited too, his whole body stilled in patience, his tail thumping the boards once in a silent invitation. After a long pause, the girl stood, shivering, and crossed the threshold. Orion rose and fell into step beside her, guiding her inside as if he'd always belonged to her. The cabin's warmth reached out, gentle and unhurried. Wade moved about the room, setting a battered kettle on the stove, pulling a blanket from the back of the sofa. The girl sank to the rug, hugging her doll to her chest, eyes darting from the fire to the windows, from Wade to Orion. She said nothing, and neither did Wade. He placed the blanket around her shoulders, careful not to touch more than necessary, then laid a pair of wool socks by the stove to warm. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if to prove there was no hurry, no danger. Orion settled beside her, close but not touching, head on his paws, gaze fixed on the door. The girl watched him, her own eyes ringed in the purple bruises of sleepless nights. She blinked, once, then twice, and let her chin rest on her knees. Outside the wind moaned, but inside the hush thickened. Wade stirred the kettle, found a chipped mug, poured hot water over a tea bag, and set it near the girl. She didn't drink, only wrapped her fingers around the cup and stared at the steam curling into the air. Hours passed this way. No questions, no conversation, only the careful exchange of small, necessary gestures. Wade stoked the fire. Orion dozed with one ear cocked for sound. The girl, at last, curled onto her side and slept, doll clutched tight, socks pulled halfway up her shins. Wade watched her from the rocker, face shadowed by lamplight, memory flickering in his gaze. He saw in the line of her cheek something of his own son, in the way Orion guarded her, something of a promise he hadn't made in years. Outside, the snow kept falling, shrouding the world in fresh silence. Inside, 3 souls, man, dog, and child, inhabited a space stitched together by small kindnesses and the gentle, persistent will to keep going. When the girl began to shiver in her sleep, Orion nudged closer, his body forming a quiet wall against the draft. Wade tucked another log on the fire and sat back, eyes drifting shut. For the first time in a long while, the ache of loneliness softened at its edges, pressed out by a deeper, older ache, the need to care, and the flicker of hope that maybe this time it would be enough. Nothing was spoken. No wounds were named. But in the hush between gusts, something in the cabin shifted, opening a seam through which healing, slow and cautious, might one day slip. Morning was slow to announce itself. In Edgewater Falls, dawn was not so much a new beginning as a subtle shifting of light, a pale, bruised glow leaking through the frost-glazed windows, drawing wavering shapes across the cabin floor. Wade Callahan sat in his old rocker, knees drawn up, hands wrapped loosely around a chipped blue mug, its contents long since gone cold. He watched the fire's low flame stretch and shrink, listening to the world exhale after a long, restless night. The little girl slept near the hearth, her body curled inward, knees tucked up beneath the oversized blanket, doll pressed to her chest. Her breathing was even, lips parted, brow smoothed by sleep. Orion rested beside her, his head on her ankles, broad body curled, as if to shield her from any remaining chill. When Wade glanced at them, man and dog, child and shadow, he felt a pressure behind his eyes that had nothing to do with fatigue. He stood and moved quietly through the room, working by habit, setting another log on the fire, tucking the wool socks further under the blanket at the girl's feet. Steam rose from the kettle, catching thin bars of light as Wade filled a small pot with oatmeal and water, stirring slowly, letting the familiar task slow his thoughts. There was comfort in small routines, in the certainty of old objects. The cabin felt different this morning, less empty, as if it were a living thing waiting to exhale. Orion stirred first, ears pricking. He lifted his head, eyes scanning the door, then the window, then Wade's face. Wade knelt beside him, running his hand gently along Orion's back. The touch was slow, absent-minded, a wordless thank you for the dog's silent vigilance. Orion yawned, mouth wide, then licked the girl's sock-covered toes as if to check that she was still there. Wade allowed himself a half-smile, faint and unfinished, before he stood again and poured steaming oatmeal into a chipped bowl. When the girl woke, it was with a slow, cautious intake of breath, as if she half expected to find herself somewhere else. A hospital bed, a silent room, another porch somewhere cold. She blinked against the thin light, hugging her doll tighter. Wade, seeing her stir, didn't approach. Instead, he set the bowl and mug of warm water on the hearth near her and retreated to the window. He drew back a corner of the curtain and watched the snow drift lazily past the glass. The sky was a washed blue, pale as skim milk, no promise of sun. In the hush that followed, only the pop of sap in the logs broke the silence. The girl sat up, gathering the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes moved between Wade and Orion. Her doll, limp and threadbare, was placed carefully on the rug as she tested the bowl with one hand, then sipped. Wade didn't speak. He let her move at her own pace, the room filling with a fragile, wordless truce. Orion shifted closer, stretching out, his body forming a soft wall between the girl and the rest of the world. His tail thumped twice, slow and muffled. The girl watched the dog, tentative at first, then reached out to trace the dark ridge of fur along his neck. Wade caught the motion out of the corner of his eye, a small, deliberate act of trust. He looked away, pretending to study the snowy branches outside, but the sting behind his eyes grew sharper. There were no explanations, no apologies, no frantic questions. Wade worked quietly, clearing the small table, folding a blanket, winding the old clock above the stove. Each movement was a signal. This is a safe place, you can rest here. When the girl finished, she set the bowl aside and lay back, eyelids fluttering. Orion pressed his head gently to her chest. She sighed, the breath catching in her throat, then evened out as she drifted once more into sleep. Wade sat on the floor across from them, back against the wall, letting his eyes close for a moment. He thought of his own son, the way the boy had laughed and pressed cold hands to his father's face on winter mornings. Grief still came in waves, but today it felt less jagged, softened by the presence of this new child, this silent dog, by the knowledge that perhaps he could still be useful to someone who needed him. As the morning deepened, the light grew stronger. Wade rose and moved through the house, his presence quiet and sure. The little girl, sensing him nearby, relaxed deeper into Orion's warmth. The house, too, seemed to sigh, shedding something old and stale, filling itself with a tentative hope. When at last she woke again, the room was brighter, the snow outside falling in lazy, fat flakes. She found her feet wrapped in thick wool, a mug of water warm at her side, and a dog, strange, gentle, silent, guarding her without question. Wade stood at the sink, back turned, as if to give her space. She watched him for a long while before, at last, her eyes drifted shut once more. No words had passed between the three. The healing was in the silence, in the firelight, in the warmth shared without condition. For now, in the quiet cabin, three wounded creatures learned the shape of comfort. Not through explanations, but through patience, stillness, and the smallest acts of care. Somewhere outside, a crow cawed, its echo lost among the trees. Inside, morning deepened, unhurried. The world, just for a while, held still. The hours between dawn and noon passed as softly as a breath. Wade moved through them as if underwater, his every step careful, the sound of his boots muffled by the thick old rug. He brewed more tea, set out another log, kept glancing at the girl and the dog as if they might dissolve in sunlight. Outside, snow kept falling, a hush settling over the woods and frozen lake, muting even the far-off call of crows. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she'd come from. He moved with the gentle detachment of someone who understood that the world sometimes handed you a wound so deep, only time and patience could touch it. Instead, he let the room fill with quiet. He washed the breakfast bowl, pausing only when Orion nudged his hand with a cold nose, then lay down again beside the girl. When Wade looked at them, child and dog, he saw something fierce and fragile blooming in the stillness. It was trust, perhaps, or the very beginning of it. It was almost noon when the girl woke again. She sat up slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar room, and pulled the blanket close around her shoulders. Her hair, tangled and shining dark against her cheek, caught the pale light leaking through the window. She looked at Wade, who stood across the room, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. For a long while, neither spoke. It was Orion who bridged the silence. He rose, shook himself, and padded over, his tail wagging slow and heavy, a living question mark. The girl's lips trembled, but she didn't shrink away. Instead, she pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the drumbeat of his heart, steady as an anchor. Then, with a suddenness that was both brave and frightened, she got to her feet. She approached Wade, not close, but close enough that her words, when they came, fell into the hush like snowflakes. Her voice was a wisp, barely there. "Mama's gone," she whispered. Each syllable seemed to cost her something. "My brothers, they're still in the house." Wade froze, the mug cradled in his palm suddenly too heavy. He saw in her eyes a look he recognized from his own reflection. From long nights when grief pressed too hard to bear, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might step forward and do what needed doing. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Instead, he knelt beside Orion, placed a hand on the dog's collar, and looked to the girl. The dog seemed to understand. His body tensed, eyes locking on the window as if reading a scent on the wind. They did not rush. Wade helped the girl into the old parka he kept by the door, its sleeves too long, the zipper sticking halfway. He found a pair of boots, 2 sizes too large, and knelt to pull them over her bare feet, careful not to meet her eyes for too long. Orion sat by the door, waiting, the tip of his tail thudding once, twice in the dust. When they stepped outside, the world was dazzling, white upon white, the sky a pale bowl of silence overhead. They walked without speaking. The girl walked at Wade's side, steps uncertain at first, then steadier, guided by the warmth of the coat and the steady presence of the dog. Orion moved just ahead, pausing at corners, checking the air, ever the silent scout. The path to house number 12 was nearly erased by drifts. The windows were frosted over, the yard silent except for the creak of the front gate as Wade pushed it open. The girl paused, pressing her hands together, lips moving as if in prayer. Wade said nothing, only laid a hand on her shoulder, a touch that was less comfort than a promise. He drew a set of old keys from his coat pocket, hands shaking only slightly, and found the one marked 12. Inside, the air was sharp with cold. Sunlight slanted through a crack in the curtains, illuminating dust motes and the stillness of rooms too long untended. Orion darted ahead, nose to the ground, body tense. Wade moved slowly, letting the girl lead the way. She tiptoed across the warped floorboards, her boots too large but her steps certain. At the end of the narrow hallway, she paused before a closed door. For a moment, the only sound was the hush of her breath. She pressed her ear to the wood, listened, then pushed gently. The door opened on a small, dim room. Two boys, twins no older than 5, huddled together under a blanket on a mattress, cheeks pink with cold, eyes wide with the hope and terror of children who have waited too long. They looked at their sister, then at Wade and Orion, and neither cried out nor smiled, only watched in silence. Orion went to them first. He moved slow, lowering his head, tail swaying in a gentle arc. He sniffed each boy in turn, then lay down beside the mattress, his body a shield against the cold that crept through the floorboards. The girl crossed the room and crawled under the blanket with her brothers, her arms folding around them both. Wade stood in the doorway, the worn key still pressed between his fingers, watching as the dog and the children found warmth in each other's presence. No one spoke. The room filled instead with the sound of breathing. 3 children, 1 dog, 1 man, all gathering around a tiny coal of hope, waiting for it to grow. The journey back was slower, each step marked by careful silence. Wade carried the youngest, the girl guiding her other brother, Orion, circling like a shepherd, alert to every gust of wind. Snow swirled around them, but inside the circle they made, child, dog, man, there was a hush that felt almost holy. They arrived home before dusk. Wade set a pot of water to boil, and for a while the house filled with the scent of broth, the slow building warmth of shared presence. Orion lay curled at the children's feet. The little girl, head bowed, sat close to the fire. Wade watched her and saw the lines of strain around her eyes begin to loosen, just a little, as she pressed her cheek to the dog's soft neck. Night crept in, gentle and unhurried. The storm outside softened to a whisper, and inside, 4 small hearts beat steady in the healing hush. Wade sat beside the fire, his own heart lighter, as if the silence itself were working to mend the broken places left too long untended. Inside Wade's cabin, the world felt softer. The blizzard's voice was just a distant murmur now, as though the wind had grown tired of shouting and settled for a sullen whisper. The girl and her brothers sat on the old couch, wrapped together beneath a patchwork quilt Wade had dug from a cedar trunk. The youngest twin leaned into his sister's side, eyelids drooping, and the older boy, though not by much, rested his head on her shoulder. Orion sat sentinel at their feet, paws crossed, his breath a silent rhythm in the hush. Wade moved around them with the patience of someone used to making do. He set a kettle to boil, rinsed tin mugs, measured powdered broth into a saucepan. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried. No clatter, no sudden noises, only the familiar music of old floorboards and water warming on the stove. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press for names or the shape of their grief. Instead, he listened for what was needed. The softest whimper, the sharp hitch of a breath, the way the girl's eyes flinched at the snap of firewood. Orion left the children's side only to circle the room, checking the door, the corners, the window panes where snow still gathered in swirls. He paused at the girl's feet, nudging her gently, then returned to the twins, offering the silent comfort of his presence. Sometimes, one of the boys would reach out, fingers hesitant, then sure, tracing the shape of his ears or burying small hands in the thick fur at his neck. The dog endured it all with the patient gravity of one who understood how wounds worked, how trust grew quiet and slow. As dusk deepened, Wade drew the curtains and lit a single lamp. Its glow softened the sharp edges of the room, pooling in corners, warming the faces gathered close. He set steaming mugs of broth in their laps, found spoons, cut thick slices of bread, and slipped a tin of honey onto the table. The little girl nodded her thanks, eyes darting from the food to Orion, then to Wade and away again. The youngest twin tried to drink without letting go of his sister's sleeve, his grip never slackening, even when the heat made him wince. Wade watched them without seeming to. In their faces, he saw hunger and exhaustion, but something more enduring. The hard shell that children build when the world has taught them caution, when too many questions have gone unanswered, or worse, answered with pain. He remembered, with an ache deep in his chest, how his own son had learned to trust slowly after hospital rooms and quiet bad news, how small gestures, an apple peeled, a nightlight left burning, had mattered more than any grand promise. He cleaned the table, fetched a bowl of warm water, a clean towel. The girl hesitated, then let him kneel beside her to bathe the twins' chilled hands and feet. The cracked skin, the faint bruises half hidden under winter layers. She watched him work, eyes wary but grateful, silent but present. Orion lay still, his tail sweeping the rug each time the boys shifted closer, his gaze soft and steady. When the practical work was done, Wade sat on the floor with his back to the stove, legs stretched out, hands folded. The children formed a loose circle, the twins pressed against their sister, the girl clutching her doll to her chest, all of them within easy reach of the dog. For a time nobody spoke. The only sounds were the slow crackle of the fire, the gentle clink of Orion's tags, and the breathing of 4 young souls rediscovering what it meant to feel safe. Night gathered at the windows. The room glowed gold, cocooned from the blue dark outside. The storm had stopped, but Wade knew the roads would be impassable until morning. He made his call to the county, his voice low, measured, explaining only that 3 children were in his care, that help would be needed when the sun returned. The dispatcher promised to send someone as soon as the plows reached their end of the lake. But until then, Wade understood. It would be just them, a small, makeshift family, held together by necessity and something like hope. He built up the fire and tucked a second quilt around the children as sleep crept over them. The girl stayed awake the longest. She stared into the flames, her hand absently tracing the lines on Orion's paw. Wade wanted to say something, anything that would fill the vast room between them. But in the end, he let the silence speak. He placed a battered teddy bear on the arm of the couch, a relic from his own son's boyhood, and saw the girl's mouth twitch in surprise. When the last mug was empty, and the fire settled into a steady pulse, Orion took his place across the threshold. He lay facing the door, ears pricked, body relaxed but ready. He was more than a pet. He was a sentinel, a silent pledge that no shadow would enter without warning. The twins sprawled into sleep, arms tangled, their breath finally deep and even. The girl, though, remained half awake, caught in that liminal space between fear and hope. Wade watched her, remembering all the nights he'd kept vigil for a child he could not save. In that memory, there was pain, but tonight, as the girl's eyes finally closed and her shoulders dropped, he felt something shift, a gentling, a loosening. It was not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The promise that small, quiet acts, shared bread, a warm lamp, a dog's steady heart, might begin to mend even the deepest cold. Outside, the world was still, the snow heaped high and undisturbed. Inside, the 4 children and the dog slept close, a hush settling over the room so profound it felt like grace. Wade sat alone a while longer, Orion's steady breathing a comfort at his back, and let the quiet seep into the cracks of his own heart. Tonight in this house of strangers, the work of kindness was enough. The night grew long, the storm, which had worn itself thin against the eaves, faded into a breathless hush. Wade sat awake in his old chair, a quilt draped over his knees, watching the room in the wavering lamplight. He listened to the gentle rhythm of sleep. 3 children nested in a tumble of blankets on the couch, their faces finely slack, their small limbs tangled together. Orion sprawled on the floor nearby, chin resting on his front paws, amber eyes half closed but never unguarded. There was a weight in the quiet, but not the heaviness of old grief. It was something gentler, expectant, a pause before a change, the way a field holds its breath the moment before the sun breaks winter's back. Wade felt it in the way the fire warmed the backs of his hands, in the faint stirrings of hope that he dared not name, in the memory of a life he had not realized he'd been waiting for. Somewhere deep in the night, one of the twins whimpered. The sound was small but sharp, a dream turning sour in the cold dark. The little girl sat up, instantly awake. She pressed her lips to her brother's forehead, murmured something Wade could not hear. He watched her, saw the tension in her thin shoulders, the stubborn set of her jaw as she settled the boy, tucking the frayed edge of the quilt beneath his chin. Orion lifted his head, eyes meeting hers, and for a long moment, they held each other's gaze. The girl's hand reached out, unthinking, to rest on the dog's head. His tail swept the floor in a slow, steady beat. Wade felt his own heart tug in his chest. There were no words for what he saw, no tidy phrase to explain the way one wounded being found comfort in another. It was enough just to witness it, a child and a dog, neither whole, sharing warmth in the middle of the hardest season. The hours slid by. Outside, the snow lay heavy and unbroken, the windows glowing with the last gold of the lamp. The children slept on, but sleep eluded Wade. He moved quietly around the cabin, checking locks, banking the fire, laying out dry clothes for morning. Every so often, he would pause by the couch, watching the steady rise and fall of 3 small chests, the soft curve of Orion's body between them and the door. He remembered other winters, waiting by a hospital bed, phone gripped so tight his knuckles went white, watching the hands of a clock that refused to hurry. The helplessness of those nights had left him with scars he seldom spoke of. But here now, there was something different in the work of waiting. There was the sense, impossible but real, that maybe this time waiting was not the same as failing. Just before dawn, the girl woke again. Her eyes were wide, dark in the lamplight. She eased herself from under her brother's arms and crossed the room on silent feet. She did not go to Wade, but to Orion. She crouched beside the dog, burying her face in his fur, breathing him in as if he were a shield. Orion shifted to accommodate her, his whole body softening, accepting her weight without question. After a long moment, she drew back, tucking the doll under her chin, and looked at Wade. There was a plea in her gaze, raw and uncertain. Wade nodded, barely perceptible, letting her know he saw her, that he understood. She sat with her back against the stove, knees drawn to her chest, and stared into the embers. Orion settled beside her, a silent companion in the pre-dawn hush. Wade brewed tea he knew she wouldn't drink, set the kettle within reach, and returned to his chair. Outside, the first dull blush of morning began to brush the edges of the snow, the sky moving from black to gray, then the faintest blue. The roads would still be closed, the plows still hours away, the help he'd called for still somewhere out of sight. Inside, though, the waiting felt different, not a holding of breath, but a holding together. As the sky lightened, The twins began to stir. The little boy stretched and whimpered, then rolled toward his sister, seeking her hand. She squeezed his fingers, not speaking, but the touch seemed to settle him. Orion rose, shook himself, and padded to the door, where he stood, watching the horizon, as if he could will the day into being. Wade found himself standing too, hands pressed to the window pane, breath fogging the glass. He watched the pale sky and the motionless world beyond. He did not know what would come next, what the county would decide, what the future would hold for these children, for himself, for the old dog who had become their sentinel. He only knew the work of this night: to wait, to witness, to keep the lamp burning against the dark. The cabin was very still. The little girl returned to her brothers, curling close as the first faint sun edged the snow outside. Wade leaned against the window, Orion beside him. The light was thin, but it was enough, a start, a promise, the quiet truth that for one more night, they had not been alone. In the deepest part of winter, waiting together was its own kind of hope. Dawn was the faintest rumor at the edge of the sky. Wade stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a mug he didn't drink from, the warmth rising up to meet the cold ache in his knuckles. Outside, the snow was blinding, unbroken and blue in the half-light. Rooflines softened, the lake gone beneath a hush so complete it felt almost holy. Inside, the air was warmer than it had any right to be, thick with the steam of oatmeal and the gentle breathing of 4 children and 1 dog, a family built from happenstance and necessity. The girl woke first. She lifted her head from her brother's shoulder, eyes seeking the window before finding Orion curled at her feet. She touched his fur lightly, as if to remind herself he was real. Then, without a word, she stood and tiptoed to the table where Wade had left a pot of tea and a plate of bread. She poured herself a cup, her hands steady despite everything. Wade watched her from across the room, giving her space but not distance. The others woke slowly, as if reluctant to leave the protection of night. The twins pressed close to each other, rubbing at their eyes. The little girl broke her bread in careful pieces and handed it first to her brothers, then to Orion, who accepted the offering with a gentle mouth and a wag of his tail. There was something new in her movements. Not quite ease, but a slackening of the tension that had bound her since she'd first appeared at Wade's door. After breakfast, the cabin settled into a hush again. The twins, still tired, lay beneath the patchwork quilt, drifting in and out of sleep. The girl sat near the fire, legs drawn up, doll in her lap, watching the flames with a solemn patience. Wade busied himself with chores, washing bowls, tending the fire, checking the phone line, but every so often he glanced at the girl, feeling the shape of a question settle in the space between them. It was Orion who finally bridged the silence. He rose, stretched, and padded over to where the girl sat. He nudged her hand, then turned and looked pointedly at the door. The girl followed his gaze, then looked at Wade. In her eyes was a request, silent, fragile, but unmistakable. Wade nodded. "It's all right," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. He found the old boots she'd worn the day before and set them by the door. The girl pulled them on and wrapped herself in her brother's hand-me-down coat. She slipped something from the pocket, a folded, wrinkled envelope, and held it against her chest. Then, almost shyly, she looked to Orion and then to Wade, as if asking permission. They stepped outside together, girl and dog and man, their breath streaming in the frozen air. The snow creaked beneath their feet, the sky overhead brightening to pale gold. The world felt fragile in that early light, every sound magnified. The snap of a twig, the crunch of boots, the distant caw of a crow. At the edge of the porch, the girl paused and crouched in the snow. She opened the envelope with careful fingers and drew out a piece of paper, smoothed soft by many readings. She held it out to Wade. He took it gently, feeling the roughness of the paper, the faint indentation where a pencil had pressed too hard. The letter was written in a looping, uncertain hand. If anyone kind finds this, please trust them. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Remember, good people keep their promises. Love, Mom. Wade read the note twice, the words blurring, not from cold but from the slow, painful thaw of something long frozen in him. He handed the letter back to the girl, who folded it and tucked it away with a care that made Wade's chest tighten. Orion sat at her side, his body pressed against her leg, offering his own silent promise. The three of them stood in the new snow, the air ringing with unsaid things. The girl turned her face up to Wade, searching his eyes for something, reassurance perhaps, or understanding. He met her gaze and, in that unguarded moment, everything unspoken was answered. There would be questions later. But for now, silence held more comfort than words. They returned inside, cheeks flushed from the cold. The little girl went to her brothers, checking them with a gentle hand before sitting quietly beside the fire. Orion curled beside her, chin on her knee, while Wade folded himself into his chair, the note still echoing in his thoughts. He did not weep, but for a long time he sat unmoving, staring at the crackling fire, feeling the enormity of what it meant to be trusted with another's hope. He remembered his son's hand in his, the weight of promises kept and lost. In that hush, grief and gratitude braided together, a quiet surrender to the ache of loving and losing, of losing and loving again. Later, as the morning wore on, the sound of snowplows rumbled somewhere in the distance, a reminder that the outside world had not forgotten them. Wade called the county again, speaking in low tones to the dispatcher, who promised help was on its way. But for now, inside the cabin, the hush was sacred, a sanctuary built not from blood, but from the fragile courage of reaching out. The girl rested her head against Orion's side and closed her eyes, her brothers sleeping close, Wade and the old dog keeping watch. And in the flicker of firelight, in the space between hurt and healing, the first seeds of trust pressed quietly into thawing earth. By the time the first hint of true morning broke through the frost-clouded glass, Wade Callahan had lost all sense of how long the night had been. The cabin felt changed, warmer, fuller, the silence now a living thing that bound everyone close rather than keeping them apart. He stood at the window, mug in hand, watching as sunlight caught the snow in sudden flashes of gold. The world outside was transformed. Roofs gleamed beneath the last wisps of mist. The road was a bright, untouched ribbon winding through the stillness, and along the lake edge, steam rose from cracks in the ice, soft and spectral. Orion was already awake, waiting near the door, tail thumping with quiet certainty. The dog had not slept much. Every sound, every shuffle from the children had roused him to attention. But now, as dawn sharpened the edges of the day, he sat with a new patience, almost as if he sensed something about to change. The twins stirred first. The youngest rolled over, blinking against the light, and reached for his sister's hand. She was already awake, hair tangled, eyes wide but no longer rimmed with fear. She looked around as if surprised to find herself safe, the weight of survival slowly lifting from her shoulders. She sat up, pulling her brothers closer, and for a long time said nothing at all. Wade cooked oatmeal again, thick, with honey and dried apples, and poured hot chocolate into battered tin cups. He set the table while the children watched, uncertain at first, then drawn by the small domestic rituals, the careful spooning out of sugar, the way he set the spoons side by side, the napkins folded into awkward triangles. The girl took her brother's hands and led them to the table. They ate quietly, shoulders brushing, stealing glances at Orion, who rested at Wade's feet, muzzle lifted for crumbs. The world outside brightened by slow degrees. Through the haze of melting frost, Wade saw movement on the lane. 2 trucks, lights flashing, crawling toward the cabin. Relief and dread tangled in his chest. He knew what must come next. The inevitable intrusion of systems and rules and paperwork. Still, he moved through the morning as if every moment was worth savoring, every small act a stitch in a larger, fragile fabric. He gathered warm coats, mittens, hats, boots. The children bundled into the clothes with the seriousness of those who have learned not to expect too much. The little girl paused by the stove, running her hand over the old teddy bear Wade had placed there the night before. She tucked it under her arm, eyes shining with a gratitude that needed no words. When the knock came, brisk, businesslike, but not unkind, Wade opened the door to the sharp blue of a January morning and the faces of the local social worker, a nurse, and an officer from the county. Their presence filled the cabin with new air, cool and official, but not unwelcome. Wade stood a little straighter, Orion by his side, as the social worker knelt to speak softly to the children. The nurse moved gently, checking the twins' hands and feet, murmuring words of comfort. The girl submitted quietly, not flinching, her gaze flickering between the adults and Orion. When the nurse finished, she smiled and pressed a sticker onto each boy's palm. The twins stared at the small, bright stars as if they were precious stones. Papers were produced, signatures gathered, questions asked and answered in low voices. Wade explained what he could, how the children had arrived, what little he knew. The officer nodded, taking notes, but paused to pat Orion's head, acknowledging the old dog's steady presence. There was no sense of hurry. Outside, the trucks idled, exhaust pluming into the morning, but inside the world held its breath, reluctant to break the spell. The social worker conferred with Wade in the kitchen, speaking quietly. "We'll need to arrange temporary guardianship until family can be contacted," she said. "You've done a good thing." Wade nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched the children, gathered together on the couch, Orion at their feet, and felt a strange surge of pride, tender, awkward, immense. In the end, the children were not taken away. Arrangements were made for Wade to care for them until a permanent solution could be found. The paperwork was signed, the nurse left extra supplies, and the officer, before departing, knelt and scratched Orion behind the ears. "Good dog," he murmured, almost reverently. When the door finally closed behind the last visitor, the cabin was quiet again. The children seemed smaller now, as if shorn of some invisible armor. The little girl pressed her face into Orion's ruff and whispered something Wade could not hear. The twins, tired from the morning's excitement, curled against her side, falling into a sleep as deep as anything Wade had seen. He stood at the window once more, watching the sun climb higher. The day was impossibly bright. The world was unchanged, and yet not the same. Inside, hope had taken root, fragile as a seed pressed into thawing earth. Later, as the children slept, Wade made tea and sat by the fire. Orion lay beside him, sighing in his sleep. The quiet was not emptiness anymore, but possibility, the beginning of a life remade by kindness, courage, and the slow healing of shared trust. Morning filled every corner of the cabin, and Wade let himself believe, if only for today, that spring would come again. Winter surrendered by degrees. Snow receded from the stoops and fence rails, uncovering the earth 1 inch at a time. The sun lingered longer each afternoon, touching the tips of bare branches and glimmering in puddles that spread across the rutted lane. In this softening season, life in Wade Callahan's house shifted too, not in loud declarations, but in small, persistent acts. The days settled into a rhythm that seemed to mend old wounds. Breakfast cooked slowly in the quiet. Mittens laid out beside mugs of cocoa, boots set to dry by the stove. The children, once strangers, brittle and silent, became a chorus of quiet voices, the twins inventing games with pebbles and bits of twine, the little girl reading aloud from tattered books with a confidence that grew stronger each day. Wade found himself listening more often than speaking, his voice now reserved for gentle reminders and small jokes that coaxed smiles from behind guarded eyes. Orion remained the steady heart of the house. He lay beneath the table while the children ate, trailed them to the porch to watch for the first brave birds, and herded them, without fuss, back indoors when the chill deepened. The children loved him fiercely, their hands always searching for his warmth. Even the youngest boy, once wary and withdrawn, now buried his face in Orion's ruff whenever bad dreams crept in. It was the dog who taught them how to trust the silent comfort of presence, who showed them that safety need not announce itself. One morning, as the sky brightened in earnest, Wade gathered the children by the door of house number 12. The twins were bundled in mismatched scarves. The little girl clutched a handful of seeds and a wooden trowel Wade had once carved for his son. Wade looked at the cracked soil along the porch, still hard, but softening at the edges, and nodded. "Let's see if we can give this place a bit of spring," he murmured, his voice a low reassurance more than a command. They worked together in the muddy patch where snow had finally released its grip. Wade broke the soil and showed the children how to press the seeds in, careful and slow, the little girl's fingers trembling with focus as she tucked each one in place. Orion watched, tail wagging, and at one point tried to dig his own hole, sending the twins into fits of laughter. Wade pretended to scold the dog, but his smile was genuine, stretching lines in his face that hadn't moved in years. The garden, like everything else, grew by increments. Some seeds never sprouted, some shoots wilted in the late frost, but others reached up, tentative and green, and by May there was a row of beans, a scatter of violets, and a single, stubborn sunflower near the steps. Each day, the children checked the garden's progress, marking each change with a quiet pride. Spring brought other changes. The county's arrangements, once provisional, stretched into summer. The children remained. By then it was unthinkable that they might be sent away. Wade handled the calls and paperwork with a patience born of necessity, answering questions from distant relatives, caseworkers, and doctors. Each answer was a promise. Yes, the children were safe. Yes, they were wanted. Yes, this was their home, if they chose it. There was a ceremony in late June at the small schoolhouse, where the girl read a poem she'd written about winter and homecoming. Wade sat in the back row. Orion pressed against his boots and listened as her voice wove hope into the words. Afterward, the twins ran in dizzying circles on the playground, Orion at their heels, their laughter echoing across the green field. Wade closed his eyes and let it fill him. That evening, after dinner, They returned to the patch of garden in front of the house number 12. The sun was sinking, gold and soft, and the children stood side by side, admiring what they had made. The little girl reached for Orion, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding him in a wordless embrace. The boys crowded close, one small hand on Wade's coat, another buried in the dog's fur. Wade watched them, his hands stained with earth, his heart oddly light. He saw, for the first time in a long while, a future that was not marked by endings, but by beginnings. New leaves on old branches, laughter where once there had been only silence, a home rebuilt by kindness and the slow, determined work of ordinary days. There was no grand speech, no proclamation of gratitude. There was only the sight of a girl resting her head against a German shepherd's side, a man standing in the soft light with mud on his boots and hope in his chest, a trio of children at ease with each other and the world. The hush of a spring evening wrapped them all, gentle and whole. As darkness fell, Wade lingered on the porch. Orion sat beside him, eyes half closed, content. The children's voices drifted up from the garden, soft as lullabies. Wade reached down, his hand resting on the dog's head, and breathed out, a sigh that left space for everything that would come after. A single act of kindness, a dog's quiet loyalty, the courage to open a door. These had changed the shape of one long winter. Now, as the first fireflies blinked against the dusk, Wade understood. Miracles were not always loud. Sometimes they were nothing more than small hands planting seeds, a child's embrace, or the patient faith that spring would find its way, even here. And so it did. In the quiet that settles after hardship, we often find the beginnings of grace. Sometimes healing comes not in grand gestures, but in the quiet loyalty of a dog, the patience of a stranger, or the simple act of letting someone new into your life. Wade, Orion, and those three children remind us that hope grows slowly, rooted in kindness, nurtured by the courage to trust again. If you've ever been changed by a small act of compassion or found comfort where you least expected, I invite you to share your own story in the comments below. Perhaps your words will help someone else find their way through the longest winter. Thank you for being here and for believing, just as Wade did, that even in the coldest seasons, a gentle heart can light the way home.